Hello everybody, welcome to my tea table. My name is Elise. Today is Constitution Study Group Day, and since it's May, I figured today would be a great time to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, the whole month of May. And I've been doing this for the past few months, be it Black History Month or oh no, my dress. I'm wearing my invisible dress. Well, this is fine. This is fine. This will be fine. And then Women's History Month, so I figured this would be the most perfect platform to talk about not only the history of Asian and Pacific Americans, Pacific Islanders in the U.S., but also talk about like the current situation and how we can better understand the oppression and the lack of respect that is paid to this community of people that has contributed much to our well-being, to our history, our culture, our art. I mean, heck, here we are in the tea fields drinking tea. We definitely wouldn't be doing this without contributions of not just Chinese history, but also Taiwanese, Japanese, Indian, Sri Lankan, and even deeper than that if you really want to go into it. I want to preface today's study group in that I've found myself personally in an interesting situation with this kind of learning and also the advocacy, just for our 14th Amendment rights, everybody's 14th Amendment rights that, by being American, we have rights. We should have respect. We should be treated equally. I always try to advocate for that for any community of people. But in my situation, in particular, it's a very interesting dynamic because I have this highly acute, very niche knowledge and experience with a cultural item of Asian history that makes it interesting and I've found myself recently being in a position of almost gatekeeping that is not right. There are probably valid points to it. So that's why I want to preface this conversation today that like I am keeping myself in check in this regards, but I also hello Byunggun Park, it is nice to meet you. Welcome to the stream. Sure, I welcome you to introduce your TX. You call it systemic tea knowledge. I'm very curious what that is. I am. Please feel free to expand in the comments. So yeah, I'm going to drink some tea. We're going to look over some articles as we usually do with the Constitution Study Group. I'm going to become tea today. Today I did not follow my own rule of not wearing green on a streaming day. But yes, the whole month of May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So, and it's in addition to that coinciding with a very vocal movement around stopping hate towards the Asian community. And that's a very deep, complex thing. I don't know how deep we're going to get into that, but one particular area of this movement is around feminism. And, March was Women's History Month, so we did talk about feminism in great depth there. And I think it's very appropriate to kind of bring the conversation back around. And I'm going to be introducing a new term, a new idea to our study group and just to the general conversation that is had on this platform, of course, with T. And that is the concept of intersectional feminism, which, kind of considers various forms of oppression, mostly between sexism and racism, and can help, for me at least, it has been helping understand that these things are not mutually exclusive of each other, and that if we truly want to be an advocate for the 14th Amendment, we really do need to understand these terms. And there was a woman, really wonderful advocate herself, educator. I actually got in touch with her and started watching her platform through TikTok. And so here's going to be another pitch for TikTok. It is actually an interesting platform that recently in the past few months I've been seeing a lot of great advocacy, human rights, 14th Amendment rights, advocacy content happening on TikTok. So TikTok is not all just Gen Z dancing, but I think it was the younger generation, the Gen Z population on TikTok that has created such a welcoming space for activists to be putting out content and to be supporting that content. I don't know this woman's name. I know her handle is Perspective instead of perspective. It's Herspective. She is a woman's or a feminist. I don't know. I forget exactly what her area of study is. Like, she just has a very powerful voice and has created a really great platform. I believe that she's going to be going into journalism. But this morning, she had a very powerful live session where she was talking about the true kind of culprit and thing that's holding us back. Yeah, I've got a tea dress on. Dawn, good to see you. Welcome to the stream. The true thing that is holding back feminism is white women, is the privilege of white women and the lack of understanding for white women, especially white women that identify as being feminists, of not understanding this concept of intersectional feminism. So I figured today would be a good one because it would be a good topic to bring up this concept. This woman is East Asian, and shares a lot about her own experiences of being sexualized, of being fetishized. But more powerful than all of that is that the brunt of the harassment and jealousy and oppression is actually coming from white women. And that's interesting. It's really interesting. So, maybe we'll touch up on that a little bit. But let's drink some tea first. So, Byung-gun says that TX is studying tea culture and knowledge on tea is good, but now we should start tea knowledge with academic units. That's great. Well, there's a lot of really great tea academic programs around the world. The most prominent ones, of course, are in China, from what I've been exposed to. Really great research going on, not only in the history of tea and the appreciation of tea, because a lot of times, and this is part of what we need to remind ourselves to do more often as we want to appreciate more and more Asian cultures or any culture in general is that tea is much more than just the chashi that we're doing here. It's much more than the gongfu-cha that we're doing here in our own service, that there is a lot of knowledge, and from my perspective, a lot more cool knowledge. I just find it endlessly fascinating around the cultivation, the production of tea itself, and the communities that tea creates. A lot of times people that start to appreciate tea really just focus on this part of it, which, is an important part of the culture. It is extremely respectable to explore that area and to advocate and introduce that culture to others. But there's a lot more to it. I think this is where my acute niche experience and education around the tea industry does bias me to kind of like by default put myself into a position of gatekeeping, which is not correct either. And so I'm always having to keep myself in check about understanding, basically it's like I've actually caught myself correcting and educating Asian people about their own culture, which is incorrect. That's something that everybody should discover on their own. So I don't know, I'm still learning. If you have suggestions, I'm open to hearing and listening and evolving myself and becoming a better person, a better advocate for this culture. But at this point, I feel like it's just most important to remind people that if we want to appreciate cultures, we really should dig in and understand the full culture and the full reverence around a culture or a practice in a culture before we assume ourselves to be experts and start advocating for it. All right, let me go check out your Facebook page. I see a lot of stuff on your Facebook page. Can you just put a link? I see a lot of stuff on your Facebook page. I don't know if I see the actual... You're very active. Yeah, I support tea education. I'm a food scientist, so that's why I'm an extra bias about understanding the cultivation and the processing of tea versus just focusing on the culture of tea. So you say that TX has 224 disciplines in 4 categories. Wow. It has mathematics, biology, economics, and physics. So that's great. Here in the United States, the UC Davis, which is a very powerful agriculture university in California, which has probably like the world's leading wine research program, has recently launched a tea research program, which is quite exciting. It's called the Global Tea Initiative. It's brand new. But really first of its kind here in the States, which is really great. But yeah, if you have a link to something, on your Facebook, I see a lot of your speaking engagements, and I'll go ahead and friend request you so that we can stay connected. But it looks like, yeah, you do a lot of guest speaking and advocacy work, which is great. That is good to know. Thank you so much for being here on the stream as we talk about Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The tea that I will be drinking today, I don't know what it is actually. It's certainly an oolong tea. I believe it's an oolong tea from the Satemwa tea estate. It's pretty long, wiry tea. I think this is the Livingston's Twist and Dry. This was just like a little cup of loose leaf tea I had sitting around. I figured I'd drink it today. Tea. There it is. Hey Nick, yeah, I just started. Welcome to the stream, Nick. Yeah, I'm going to be introducing, I think I'm going to spend most of today's talk talking about intersectional feminism. Because I feel like even though the modern oppression towards the Asian American community is targeted towards both genders, some of the most recent violent crimes had cited over-sexualization and fetishization as the source of the fear or the hate that initiated that violence. So we're talking about feminism then. We're talking about sexism. We're talking about overly sexualizing. This is something that not only the men are responsible for doing, but the women are also responsible in their insecurities in perpetuating. And so that's why I want to talk about intersectional feminism, because this could be a kind of a cool case to understand how women, particularly white women, okay, how they are actually playing a role in perpetuating this. Even women that identify as being feminists are perpetuating the Asian hate through their own insecurities, which, not to blame them, not to blame us, I should say, but we can't start making the change until we understand the very complex dynamic that's going on here. We're not just talking about sexism, this is multiple layers of oppression. Cheers. Oh no, this is different. This is different. This is lovely. What tea is this? Yeah, this is definitely not the Satemwa. Oh, it's gonna come to me what it is. It's a lovely tea. But now I'm warm. The tea warmed me up. I probably should have had some green tea. Cool me down. I'll remember the tea. It's beautiful. Look at that color. Super clean. I got a little filter on Instagram, so maybe the color is not completely accurate. The filter says, stop hate. It says stop hate. Oh wow. Okay, so you just sent me your full curriculum for this. This is great. I'm gonna check it out. Not right now during stream, but yeah, Jonelle. Before. Yeah, there's so much tea in this warehouse. It's hard to keep track of all of it. So this is. I think it's a Darjeeling, actually. I don't know which one. It's probably the second flush. You know what? This is Jonelle. This is the extra second flush that we were drinking the other day. But yeah, Jonelle, we'll get to it. I'm gonna get to the intersectional feminism because that's gonna be probably the meat of today's conversation. But before I do that, I just want to honor and respect the the platform on which we're talking on that topic, which is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Hey Kayla, good to see you. Yeah, so the month of May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. This is coming from the U.S. government page from the Library of Congress. So this is like the official, page and explanation. Yeah, the strong tea, but you know what? No, the strong tea was the moonshine. This is lighter. This has like a lighter brew. Yeah, I'm very certain this is the second flush Darjeeling that you took home. When was it started? When did we start celebrating this? It doesn't say here. Usually on these pages it says like the history of when the holiday started. So this is more about veterans. There are 300,000 living Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander American veterans. So the purpose of this page is to share stories. They're having events to celebrate stories of different people standing together against hate, which has become like a really relevant... Oh, this is not the moonshine. This is... The moonshine was that special Nepalese tea, the hybrid green-white oolong. That one is really special. I don't even have any of that tea around for me to drink. So it's really special that you have it, Dawn. I hope you didn't drink it all at once. It says, National Park Service celebrates Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have a rich heritage thousands of years old and have both shaped the history of the U.S. and had their lives dramatically influenced by moments in its history. Every May during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month and throughout the year, the National Park Service and its partners share those histories, which is great. I'm just like really quickly trying to look up the history of the holiday, when it started. 1977 introduced. So this is modern. A lot of these like monthly observation holidays that we have in our country are very modern things. 1977 was when it was introduced. But let's look at the intersection of the Constitution and the history of Asian Americans. And so this is coming from the Constitutional Accountability Center. A pretty modern article addressing contemporary issues around the subject. Yeah, Byung-gun, I saw that. You sent me the TX through Facebook message. I will follow up with you on it because it is very interesting to me. It is very interesting. Let me fix this. This is bothering me. Mass shootings and frequent attacks have brought violence against Asian Americans to the forefront of our national attention. We keep learning of incident after horrific incident where Asian Americans have been violently targeted simply for being Asian American. Unfortunately, violence against Asian Americans has a long history in this country. At the same time, Asian Americans have long been part of America's history, and the Constitution promises Asian Americans equality and justice, as it does for all of America. So that's the 14th Amendment. In fact, Asian Americans have played an important role in demanding their rights be respected, particularly through the promises of the 14th Amendment. Hatred toward Asian Americans did not just begin with our most recent president and his supporters who blamed them for our current pandemic. Since their arrival in larger numbers in the 19th century, Asian Americans have experienced deep hatred and violence directed at them. For instance, in the Chinese Massacre of 1871, after the 1870 passage of the Naturalization Act that prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized American citizens, at least 17 Chinese people were lynched by rioters after a white man had been murdered. Asian Americans have long been cast as the other, to be feared and blamed for taking jobs and other resources from white Americans. In more recent history, Asian Americans have been labeled the modeled minority, largely an attempt to minimize the systemic impact of ongoing racism toward Black Americans and the legacy of slavery. So every experience is different, but the oppression itself and the systemic oppression, the government supported and government backed oppression is exactly the same. And we're talking about the Constitution here, which clearly states that every American has the same rights. But I mean, what was this? I have another article that has a lot more of the history of the different laws that oppressed different Asian communities throughout history. As generations of Americans fought to uphold the rights promised to them in the Constitution, and particularly in the 14th Amendment, Asian Americans were included in the forefront. In particular, the Supreme Court case Yik Woo versus Hopkins in U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark vindicated rights important to many Americans. In Yik Woo versus Hopkins from 1886, Chinese laundry facilities were being targeted by a local ordinance in San Francisco. The Supreme Court ruled that even if the text of the ordinance did not explicitly target Chinese owners, racially discriminatory administration of the ordinance rendered it unconstitutional. The court held that the 14th Amendment provides for equal protection for all people regardless of race and citizenship. So there's a positive case where the Constitution was actually effective in protecting some rights. In U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, Wong Kim Ark was born in the U.S. and was denied entry back into the country after travel to China. He challenged this denial, and the Supreme Court upheld his citizenship. The court explained that the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment applied to Wong Kim Ark as well as to anyone born in the U.S. The clause states, this is the 14th Amendment. We've gone over this a long time ago. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. Certainly, the Supreme Court has not always vindicated the rights of Asian Americans. As one scholar states, there's a long history of racism directed at Japanese Americans in California, and it very much manifested itself in what occurred in Korematsu versus United States, 1944. Often cited as one of the court's worst decisions of all time, the court held that Japanese Americans could be moved from their homes to internment camps. It wasn't until 2018 that the Supreme Court repudiated this case, but ironically, Chief Justice John Roberts did so as he upheld former President DT's Muslim ban in a deeply problematic opinion that itself harmed many Asian Americans and their families. As we look to the future, Asian Americans, like all Americans, can and will continue to look to the Constitution to vindicate their rights to equality and justice under the law. As America continues the hard and necessary work of racial justice, embracing the text, history, and values of the whole Constitution, including the Reconstruction Amendments, will be essential. It is in only doing that we can so fulfill the promises of the Constitution for all of us, including Asian Americans. So, the Constitution here is pretty cut and dry. What we'll be getting into a little bit later is more subtle, it's more cultural, but gosh darn it, like, this is civility. This is us being polite to one another and understanding how our insecurities and our opinions and our interactions with other people can create great harm and, in extreme cases, violence. This is an article from PBS that I found that has quite a bit more specifics historically of oppression towards Asian Americans, published on April 9th of 2020. So also a modern take. in a recent Washington Post op-ed, former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang called upon Asian Americans to become part of the solution against COVID-19. In the face of rising anti-Asian racist actions, now at 100 reported cases per day, this was last year, it's, probably similar. Yang implores Asian Americans to wear red, white, and blue in their efforts to combat the virus. Optimistically, before someone started calling it the Chinese virus, Yang believed that getting the virus under control would rid this country of its anti-Asian racism. But Asian American history, this writer's particular field of research, suggests a sobering reality. So here he mentions again the model minority, which, I don't know, it's here. The model minority concept, developed during and after World War II, posits that Asian Americans were the ideal immigrants of color to the United States due to their economic success. But then that leaves opportunity for, insecurities to come in too. Be successful, but not too successful. You don't want to take our success from us. But in the U.S., Asian Americans have long been considered as a threat to the nation that promotes a whites-only immigration policy. They called this yellow peril, unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. In the late 19th century, white nativists spread xenophobic propaganda about Chinese uncleanliness in San Francisco. This fueled the passage of the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in the U.S. that barred immigration solely based on race. Initially, the act placed a 10-year moratorium on all Chinese migration. I remember studying this in high school. I remember learning about this in high school. And also remember my teacher that described this to us made it very clear that this type of oppression no longer existed in our country. Maybe not so blatant. In the early 20th century, American officials in the Philippines, then a former colony of the U.S., denigrated Filipinos for their supposedly unclean and uncivilized bodies. Colonial officers and doctors identified two enemies: Filipino insurgents against American rule and tropical diseases festering in native bodies. By pointing to Filipinos' political and medical unruliness, these officials justified continued U.S. colonial rule in the island. So this goes back to one of the first topics that we ever had here during the Constitution Study Group, which is the definition of civil versus savage. Civilized versus savage. It's so cleanliness or their perceived idea of cleanliness. Because there's been places that I've gone to in Asia that they have their own perception about what it means to be civilized. So everybody's perception's different, but overall, the overarching definition is the capacity for politeness. So the first step to be civilized is just understanding that everybody's experience is different and their perspective is different. That's the first step. So then it goes into the same, talking about, the Japanese internment camps, which, also based on fear and hate. In the 20th century, even the most multicultural North American cities, like Toronto, are hotbeds for virulent racism. During the 2003 SARS outbreak, Toronto saw a rise in anti-Asian racism, much like that of today. In her 2008 study, sociologist Carrie-Anne Leung highlights the everyday racism against Chinese and Filipino healthcare workers in the years that followed the SARS crisis. While publicly celebrated for their work in hospitals and other health facilities, these women found themselves fearing for their lives on their way home. Over the past decade, from Pulitzer Prizes to popular films, Asian Americans have slowly been gaining better representation in Hollywood and other cultural industries, such as tea, right? That's what we're trying to do here. Whereas the Joy Luck Club had long been the most infamous depiction of Asianness in Hollywood, by the 2018 Golden Globes, Sandra Oh declared her now famous adage, "It's an honor to just be Asian." It was, at least at face value, a moment of cultural inclusion. However, so-called Asian American inclusion has a dark side. In reality, as cultural historian Robert G. Lee has argued, inclusion can and has been used to undermine the activism of African Americans, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups in the U.S. In the words of writer Frank Chin in 1974, "Whites love us because we're not black." But they're still identified through their color of their skin or how they look. Oh, this is interesting. In 1943, a year after the U.S. incarcerated Japanese Americans, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. White liberals advocated for the repeal not out of altruism towards Chinese migrants, but to advocate for Trans-Pacific alliance against Japan and the Axis powers. It's all political. By allowing for the free passage of Chinese migrants to the U.S., the nation could show its supposed fitness as an interracial superpower that rivaled Japan and Germany. Meanwhile, incarcerated Japanese Americans in camps and African Americans were still held under the Jim Crow segregation laws. As history shows, Asian American communities stand to gain more working within communities and across the lines of race rather than trying to appeal to this power. Japanese American activists such as the late Yuri Kochiyama worked in solidarity with other communities of color to advance the civil rights movement. And this is when we can start talking about intersectional feminism, because this is where I started hearing about it too, was women from different groups coming together under solidarity, under a common message. So yeah, I think it's now time to move on. Let's do it. Jonelle, if you're still here, we're gonna do it. So this is coming from the UN Women page. United Nations has like a division that's specifically focused on women's rights. I believe I spent some time on this site during Women's History Month, as well as when we were talking about human trafficking, on Human Trafficking Awareness Day. Intersectional feminism, what it means and why it matters right now. From the disparate impacts of the COVID-19 crisis in communities around the globe to international protests against racism and discrimination, current events have shown that we are far from achieving equality. Trying to interpret and battle a multitude of injustices right now may feel overwhelming. How do we take all of these issues, and why should we? Intersectional feminism offers a lens through which we can better understand one and another and strive towards a more just future for all. Kimberly Crenshaw, an American law professor who coined the term in 1989, not that long ago. 1989 explains intersectional feminism as a prism of seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. In a recent interview with Time. All inequality is not created equal, she says. An intersectional approach shows that the way that people's social identities can overlap, creating compounding experiences of discrimination. So the speeches that I've heard on this and the papers I've read on this do cite that Black women have the experience that, you know, does cross over these layers in a big way. But the fact that Asian women and Black women, or not even just women, but as we saw in the last article, how the Asian community and the Black community can work together under solidarity is the same concept we're talking about here. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, and immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts, Crenshaw says. Intersectional feminism centers the voice of those experiencing overlapping, concurrent forms of oppression in order to understand the depths of the inequalities and the relationships among them in any given context. So basically, the moral of the story here is that if you consider yourself a feminist and you don't consider this, you're not doing the full amount of work. And I think I want to take this chance to kind of share a personal story about when I first not identified but started to pursue my education in feminism, because I didn't always, by a long stretch. I didn't understand any of these concepts. I was coming from a place of a lot of privilege, and I still do. But I just figured that if I had strength to overcome any oppression or discrimination for being a woman, that it didn't matter. And the events that changed my whole perspective on that involved an influential person in my life. This person had a power dynamic over me. And this person had a power dynamic over a lot of people. Probably every single person in this person's life. And I personally never felt any direct oppression or sexualization from this person. Simply because I didn't fit the profile of what they were going for. And a few years after I met this person and started working with this person, I had seen repeatedly behaviors from this person of exploiting their position of power with women in particular, but I'm sure I saw it happening with anybody. You know, he came from a very high position of privilege and the control and the influence that he had over people, particularly Asian women. And this is a common trend in Silicon Valley. This is where I was. This was in Silicon Valley. And this person ended up being the second person of Silicon Valley called out in the Me Too movement. And during that time, many of these women published their stories of being sexually assaulted by this man. And the context in which they allowed that to happen, right? Because they were fundraising for their business. They they needed the influence from this man. And he was totally exploiting his position of power, and we all knew it. I saw it. We even spoke among each other, like my peers that were, also in a position, a power dynamic position with this man. We spoke about it. How inappropriate it was. This man's married. Why is he hanging out with this woman that he's definitely not going to fund or give money to? But we didn't say anything, And so after reading these women's stories and seeing the hurt and the pain that was caused by this man, and remembering all of those times that I never held him accountable. Of course, there was a power dynamic there, but I don't give a fuck anymore. I don't care what kind of power dynamic that you have over me, including the people that have the most important power dynamic over me, which is my parents. If someone needs to be held accountable for their ill behavior, they need to be held accountable for it. Because people get hurt in a very big way. And it is this exact same sexualization and fetishization that is causing a lot of the Asian hate violence, specifically towards women. Right? What was the situation, the terrible story that happened in Atlanta, where the offender blamed it on his sex addiction. He immediately sexualized the situation. Fuck that. And not only the men responsible for their fetishization, so now if I have a friend or someone and I hear them say that they dream about being with an Asian woman, or I fucking hold them accountable, because that is not productive. Yes, pursue relationships with all types of people, but when you actively sexualize and fetishize somebody and a whole group of people, you may think that, oh, I'm actually helping, I'm loving this group of people. That's what is led to these really horrific violent crimes that were all done in the name of sex, all done in the name of promiscuity, or whatever you want to call it. And women that have and a lot of these women identify as being feminists, right? Because women don't like being oppressed, so supporting feminism is the thing to do. But women that play into that, and I've had it directly myself, I've been in relationships with men that have through their fetishization of Asian women, have developed an insecurity in myself. And that could also lead to oppression, hatred, harassment from white women to Asian women. And this is what the feminist activist, the intersectional feminist activist that I listened to this morning was talking about. She was in tears because she identified that every single one of the people that harasses her on her page is white women. And all she talks about is feminism. She's constantly helping people understand feminism and understand how to uplift men, because that's an important part too, is you gotta uplift the men and their perspective on it, and how ironic or fucking sad it is that the women that, or the people, not the women, but the people that end up being the most offended and the most fragile and the most to retaliate back with harassment are white women. And when she was talking about that, it just the memory of that, the memory of in Silicon Valley, how many white men do you see married to Asian women? And it's not just Silicon Valley, it's everywhere. And it's the backbone of freaking human trafficking and sex tourism. It doesn't mean that we should penalize or hold accountable any romantic partnership that develops between a white man and an Asian woman. That could be a legitimate romantic connection, but there's something to be said when the majority of your your white male peers are in relationships with Asian women, and what that does for other women when they see that, and it builds these insecurities. And so yeah, she ended up, the woman this morning I was listening to identified that and said, these women think that we're stealing their men. They're not. It's just because the men have fetishized Asian women. A little off topic from talking about the constitutional right, but on topic, because the 14th Amendment states that any American or U.S. citizen, anybody born in the U.S., naturalized in the U.S., is due the same rights as anybody else. They are due the same amount of civility and politeness than anybody else. So we shouldn't hate anymore, especially women hating women, right? That's why I brought it up, and that's why I brought up this concept of intersectional feminism, because it's a big piece of the puzzle, and I've only discovered it lately, like really lately. And I've been on this journey of studying feminism because of the story that I shared with you about my investor that was a total perv and just totally took advantage of his power, specifically with Asian women. But and hatred towards Asian women is not just here in the States. Like, the patriarch is in other places too. And I hope that those communities are finding the platform to speak on that and to make a path towards the cultural restoration needed to empower people. So that's it. I guess we lost Jonelle. Jonelle was interested in learning about intersectional feminism, but I guess she had to leave. So we've gotten that out of the way. Those topics were all kind of based on hate, which is sad, because in all of these Black History Month, Women's History Month, like, the whole purpose of these months of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is to celebrate the stories, the positive stories. But I couldn't jump right into that without addressing the context in which hate is happening. Because for so long, like what we saw in those articles, Asians were considered what was the word they used? That was my first time to see that. But they were considered the model minority. Because they value intelligence, they value business, they value economics, which is great. Yes, let's celebrate that, but don't use that as a way to cover up an inherent hatred and racism that is already there. And all of that inherent racism and oppression is all rooted in the ideas behind the model minority. Just like a wealthy, powerful white man may say, oh, an Asian wife is your model wife because she's beautiful and sexualized and submissive and docile. And then hate crimes happen. And no one should wonder why. So, yeah, let's celebrate the good stories. We've got that out of the way. I mean, first and foremost, I brought it up at the beginning of the stream, but celebrating the culture that's brought to us, specifically what we have right in front of us, you know, and like the ability of the cultures to adapt and to become new and to not be offended. It's incredible. You know, that like tea in and of itself is a culture that's open and accessible to everybody. And there may be some offense taken. But when it comes to tea, the only time I've ever seen offense taken, and it was hardly taken, but it's still important to acknowledge that and to be aware of it, is when reverence that is not earned is applied to something that you're doing. So when if a Chinese person walks in on you doing Gong Fu Cha, just serving tea, even just for yourself, or inviting them in to come have a cup of tea with you, and even if you're not holding the Gai Wan perfect and you're not doing everything perfect, like, you're never gonna offend anybody. Now, if you are claiming to be doing like a Taoist tea ceremony that's rooted in a long lineage, then yeah, you're gonna start offending. Because that's reverence. That's reverence that potentially hasn't been earned. More than likely hasn't been earned. It can be earned. Just like any other type of reverent ritual requires study, practice. And the funny thing is that by the time you put all of that effort into that part of it, you're so immersed in it that you don't even like care about attributing any kind of reverence to it. At least from the outside perspective. Of course, in your own heart, yeah. And that's where it's the most important. You come to realize that's where it's the most important. Not for you to have like a blog and like an Instagram account where you claim to, you know, be some kind of practitioner of some lineage. So I'm gonna look that up right now. I'm just curious. I can't even find anybody who is attributed for bringing Chinese tea to the U.S. Can't find that. I mean, who's this guy? Some guy named Peter is credited for introducing tea in the U.S. and, well, it wasn't the U.S. at that point, but attributed for bringing tea here in 1650, but definitely not Chinese. Although the tea may have been coming from China, probably was coming from China. Dutch. He was the Director General of the colony of New Netherland, which was split into New York and New Jersey. Oh, learned something new. I didn't know that. So he's attributed for introducing tea, which was probably Chinese tea. but also probably not Chinese tea culture. Well, this article says that Chinese teapots were used. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I've heard several times that the tea that was being enjoyed during the 18th century was very good quality tea. What was dumped in the Boston Harbor was good stuff. Yeah, I've got to do more research on this. I'm going to do that. And another time when I come on, maybe not next week during the Constitution Study Group, but I think as a part of celebrating this month, I think that would be good research. And it may be more modern than we think. I think it actually may be someone from like the 1960s or the 1980s that actually started bringing like traditional Asian tea cultures to the U.S. I've heard different stories, so I'll have to really look into that and kind of tell that story, because thank you to that person for bringing such a great inclusive culture for us to enjoy and share. Yeah, the harbor had some good tea going on, that's for sure. Brian, how you doing? I just had a pretty heavy conversation, so I'm reeling from it. I discussed intersectional feminism, which, is related to Asian Heritage Month, just because one of our current sources of hatred and inability to appreciate and love is a gap in our idea of feminism. And we have to understand the many layers of feminism and racism. But I think I'm gonna go sit down and unwind from this conversation. But I appreciate the ability to have it. Oh, Brian, I was just, trying to do a little research on who is credited with bringing Chinese tea culture to the U.S. I didn't find anything, so I may have to make something up. Not make it up, but do the research and figure that out. Alright, everyone. Much love to everybody. Yeah, Brian, if you want to help me figure that out. Because, yeah, I would like to, at the very least, like, just make a shout out sometime during this month. Because I think that's a great blessing. It's a great blessing of our appreciation of Asian culture here in the U.S. by everybody. Is this great gift, you know, the Gung Fu Cha that we get to practice. I don't know, I've heard somebody in the Bay Area that started bringing pu'er tea and introducing that and getting it into different tea shops and businesses. That may be it. But it may be someone else too. But, yeah. Do I have anybody here from Twitch? Yeah, it's a few people here. Who's here? Let's go see who we can raid. Alright. Hi, Instagram. This local girl, Vegas girl, is streaming gaming. Let's go check her game out. I've never raided her before. I've always wanted to go and say hi. Fellow Vegas streamer. For hanging out, everybody. And I'll see you tomorrow for Tea Talks. We'll be having fun. Have a good night.